Hello everyone and welcome to this painting tutorial. Today we'll be painting Ramsay Bolton, Greatjon Umber, and Gregor Clegane, The Mountain That Rides, all from the A Song of Ice and Fire tabletop miniatures game. In this tutorial I'll be going through all of the steps that I take to paint these miniatures up from their unprimed original state through to their completion. Something that differentiates my workflow in this episode from other videos on my channel, if you've watched any of those, is that we will be trying azimuthal shading as part of our priming process here. We're going to jump right into it with the priming by breaking out our Vallejo black surface primer and a little bit of the Vallejo gray and loading them into my airbrush. This is a Badger Patriot 105 airbrush, and if you'd like to see my full list of equipment, you can check down in the description to see that and get an idea of what you should be looking for at your local craft store or online if you want to follow along. Use a broad bristle brush to mix together any paints that you put into the hopper of an airbrush, making sure you go fully to the bottom of the hopper so that the first stuff to come out of your airbrush isn't just unmixed, streaky mess. As you apply the primer, keep the airbrush a decent distance away from the miniature, and make sure to pick up the miniatures and move them around so you can get all the little undercuts and areas that you would otherwise miss if you just attack them from one direction. When you've done this, load up your airbrush with only the Vallejo gray and hit the miniatures from the top. Here you can see I'm rotating the miniature a little bit to make sure the sides have a little bit of coverage, but I'm trying to keep the angle from above the whole time. This will mean that the miniature's got a highlight pre-baked into him just from the priming step that's going to show through all of our later steps of washing with inks and give it a little bit more dynamic sort of lighting effect. I'm going to mix together some Bombay India ink yellow and brown to make a yellow that's just a little less fluorescent than the default yellow from the bottle. And I'm going to apply that to all of the areas on Gregor Clegane that would be fabric or part of his heraldry. So his tabard, his shield, I'm not going to do the cape because I want that to be gray to give a little bit of contrast. Immediately after this, grab a little bit of magenta and red and mix those together. Just like with the yellow and brown, I'm using the magenta here to cut down the red's vibrancy and make it a little more grounded and a little more deep. If you make any mistakes, feel free to wipe them away with your thumb, your finger, or a Kleenex. Just get to them relatively quickly. That being said, right now we're on the early steps, and if we do mess things up a little bit, we're going to be covering it up with later layers of darker paints anyway. I'm mixing together a little bit of white ink into this red magenta mix now to make a pinker color, which I'm going to be using as the base for Ramsay Bolton's cloak. The Bolton family's color is pink, so I'm trying for a little bit of a dusty pink here that we're going to be deepening a little later with a little extra red, just to give it a little more vibrancy. As we paint these characters, we're going to be working from light colors to dark colors, giving us the opportunity to cover up any mistakes we make with the darker colors we're putting on later. That being said, that does mean that as you get later into the process, you're going to want to be a little more careful with the colors you're applying, because they have more potential to smudge over the earlier colors you've put down. Here I'm mixing together some black ink and some white acrylic paint with just a little bit of Vallejo Flow Improver to give it a little bit more flow, as the name would suggest, and I'm going to be using that across the Mountain That Rides' cape. By adding the Flow Improver to the mixture, I'm giving it just enough flow that we're going to be able to see the shading underneath the application of paint. And this will also work just as well for the top of Ramsay's cloak, where he's got some fur. Anywhere else you'd like to put some gray color, you can do this, and you'll see that by thinning out our paint just a little bit, we've now allowed the shading we did while priming these miniatures to show through a little bit and give a little bit of dynamism that would otherwise have been covered up by the white acrylic paint. Here we're using our red and magenta mixture to go back over Ramsay's pink cloak and just touch up all the areas where it doesn't look perfectly thick and didn't have great coverage. Grabbing our gray mixture again, we're just going to cover up the bottom edge of the Greatjon's cloak, which I also want to be gray. I'm using these colors to sort of alternate between warm and cool colors across the miniature and try and give me some alternating bands so that I can really make the shapes of the miniature pop, even from tabletop distance, which is to say, 3 feet away when the miniature's on the table in front of you. Brown here is going to be a busy color you're going to be putting onto lots of parts of your miniature. I just apply it straight out the bottle, and then if I want to darken that brown later, I can do so by applying more layers. If I want to lighten it later, I can do so by applying lighter colors. But just put on some flat brown to begin with across all of the areas that you would like to see as brown. This normally includes any leather, fur, maybe hair on other miniatures, if not these ones. the grips of weapons, and of course, the boots of our miniatures. Once again, apply the ink fairly thickly and just be comfortable with it, splash it on. Be a little careful that you're not splashing this over your lighter colors that are adjacent to it, like the pink here or the gray, but let the ink flow on the miniature, because it flowing away and dipping into the crevices is going to be what works with our azimuthal shading, our primer there, to make the miniature's details really stand out. Gregor Clegane has relatively few brown areas, but I will draw your attention to his stirrups, his saddle, and the grip of his weapon, as well as maybe his gauntlets if you'd like to make the fingers leather like I did. Next up, we're going to attack the black areas on our miniatures. Hair on Ramsay Bolton, for example, or Gregor Clegane's big black warhorse. To do this, I'm going to thin out my black ink just a little bit with some of that Vallejo Flow Improver, giving it a little bit less coverage and making it so that even applying it to the Greatjon, for example, we'll get a gray-haired or older effect rather than a straight raven black-haired effect. I'll then be using a mixture of this thinned black ink and my unthinned black ink across the horse and across Ramsay Bolton, depending on how dark I want the areas in particular to be. I recommend using unthinned black ink on most of Gregor Clegane's horse, just to give the horse a little more darker, a vibrant color. Mixing some silver paint into our black ink now, we can apply what we're going to be using as our base color for our metallic areas, which is this black-silver mixture, to anything that we want to be metallic. These being medieval-styled characters, there's going to be quite a bit of that, most notably weapons and armor. Gregor Clegane in particular is just a giant behemoth, a juggernaut of armor, so make sure you apply that everywhere that you're going to want to color in with metallic colors later. We're not going straight silver now because we're going to be applying a matte varnish later to finish off our miniatures, and that would rob any silver paint we put on of any of its shine. So, by putting this on, we're just filling in the shadows, and we'll be putting the silver on after we varnish. Be careful as you put the metallic paint over top, because it is super dark and it will absolutely stain anything you get it on. I'm taking the opportunity now, while the metallic areas are drying, to put a little more red on Ramsay's cloak and onto the Greatjon's tabard, and now moving on with just straight black ink to touch up Gregor Clegane's heraldry. We're onto the details now, and we're just making sure that all the colors are as deep, as vibrant, and as even as we want them to look on our final product. When you're doing the heraldry, watch how charged your brush is, because you don't want that black ink running all over Gregor Clegane's beautiful yellow heraldry. Grab some Vallejo Cork Brown now, and you can do the horn on the Greatjon's belt, as well as the bases of all three miniatures. This Cork Brown color is going to give you a little bit of a nice earthy, sandy color, and it'll be a perfect base for our later basing work. While you're applying that, try to make sure that you don't get it onto the little stones on the Greatjon's base or onto the boots of the characters as best you can, because little details like that standing out from the ground are really going to make the miniatures look dynamic later. Now you can just grab some straight up white acrylic paint. We're starting with this as the base for our skin tone. Now skin tone is going to be a really interesting sort of step-by-step process here, wherein we're going to work with a first palette of some brown, some yellow, and some magenta mixed into white acrylic paint, which will give it some thickness. And we are going to be applying this in gradually lighter layers of smaller and smaller areas across, most notably, the faces of Ramsay Bolton and the Greatjon. Painting in faces can be super intimidating because it's probably the most detailed work we're going to be doing in this entire workflow. It's kind of why I work this way. This process of using inks to wash everything lets it happen really, really quickly, even in little sittings after work or whatever I'm doing that day, and get a really nice result over most of the miniature. The face, though, I want to put a little more work into because it is sort of the focal point of the miniature. It's where everyone's going to look first, just like how you look at people's faces in real life. So we want to put a little more work into that area, and people are going to notice it. This is going to be a little touch that might really make your miniature stand out on the tabletop. So it's going to take a little more work. It's going to be a little more precise than potentially everything else we're doing, but I think it's worth it. Grab some of that new mixture you've made, that sort of rosy, pinkish brown color, and just lay it onto the miniature's faces, making sure to leave the crevices still shaded by our brown ink. The area you're going to be painting sort of looks like a T across the forehead at the bridge of the nose, with some dots for the cheeks and chin in particular, that you're going to want to pull out from that brown undercoat. When you've done that, go back to your skin tone and mix in some more white until you've got a noticeably different shade of skin tone. And then go back to those areas you just painted and paint them again, but be a little more delicate. Cover a smaller area. Leave the brown, the deep dark brown wash on the outside. Then that color that you just added, as a ring inside that. And then keep working inwards, in rings, sort of like a bullseye, so that the very center of any skin area that you're painting is going to be the brightest, and the outsides are going to be shaded. This will make the miniatures' faces look vibrant, and it'll make them look three-dimensional by giving just a little more shading and a little more sort of dynamic lighting to them. Again, I'm mixing in a little more white acrylic paint, and because it was thickening up a little more than I wanted it to, I put in some flow improver. Now with this third layer, we're going to cover an even smaller area. We're going to focus on just the highest points, the biggest highlights, the tip of the nose, the very top of the brow line there, the points of the cheeks, just the areas that would be catching the most light and would pop out the most from the face. By doing this, you'll probably see that you're actually drawing out the contours of the face really well, so that face is now going to be sort of transmitted to viewers from further away, where just a flat color from tabletop distance doesn't really look like much. This effect that we've achieved by highlighting the way we have is actually going to show from quite a ways away on your table. We're now going to put in the eyes, and again, this is super precise work you don't necessarily need to do, but if you have a small pointy brush or even the end of a toothpick, just put some white into the nooks, making sure to leave, again, some shading around the edges. And then go in with the point of a very small, again, toothpick, piece of wire, paintbrush if you have a fine one, and just put some black ink in. Now I'm going to put the pupils centered largely, or else looking off to a side or the other. I'm not going to try and make the miniature look straight ahead, because if the miniature's looking straight ahead and I get things offset, they look cross-eyed super easily, and you wouldn't believe how easy that is to notice when you're looking at a miniature that's been done a little hastily. So I'll try and make my miniatures look to one side or the other, just to avoid any issues with that at all. Grab some white and some red now and make a little pink color, and you can use that to pick out the nostrils and ears on Gregor Clegane's horse, and then next the lips on our miniatures, who have their faces uncovered, of course, unlike Sir Gregor Clegane here riding into battle with his big bucket helmet. Keep an eye out if you have pets, just like me, for animal hairs as you go along, and pick them off if you do notice them. As we get around to actually varnishing the miniatures, any animal hairs that are there are going to stay there, so you do want to pick them off as soon as possible. When you're painting the lips as well, try to just paint the lower lip, because that's the one that catches the most light. If the upper lip is still brown, that's going to look just fine. Next up, we're going to work on the bases for our miniatures, so grab some texture paste. You can also do this with white glue and sand, or any number of other sort of texturing products, but I have a texture paste I bought from my local art store, Michael's, and I just smudge that on to the miniature's bases. If you get big lumps like you see here on the screen, you can leave them there because they'll look kind of like big rocks or accumulations of gravel or something like that. You don't need to smush everything right down. What we're trying to do right now is just break up the flat surface that our miniatures are sitting on, so it doesn't look like they're standing on a billiards table, but instead are standing out on the field of battle, Because this is mainly white glue based as well, you can just wipe it away with your thumb if you get any over the side. Once that is set up, you'll see the whiteness goes away as the glue dries, and you're left with all these black pebbles. We'll cover up those black pebbles with our Vallejo Cork Brown to blend them in with the rest of the base. If you can't fully cover them because there's some nooks and crannies between the little beads, that's fine, because we're going to be coming back at these guys with a brown ink very soon and washing the base to make the texture pop even more. So those dark areas are probably going to get hit by the ink anyway, and if they do look a little shaded, again, this is all about texture. So, throw some brown ink down on your palette, get the biggest, fluffiest brush you got, and just supercharge that bad boy and dump the ink onto the bases. An alternate way of doing this, if you do have dropper caps like my ink bottles have, you can just put a drop onto the base and spread it around with your big fluffy brush. Just make sure you got a rather thick amount onto the base so that it looks brown, wet, and muddy. While you're doing this, of course, you can take the opportunity to make other things brown, wet, and muddy, like the hooves of the horse in this case, or, for example, the hems of tabards and capes that you think might be dragging in the mud. I'm using a small brush right now to spread things around lightly without overdoing it, because I don't want it to look, bright brown on the miniature so much as I just want things to be a little smudged and faded and just look slightly weathered. We're now going to grab some white glue when everything's dried up again, and just chuck that around our base here and there, little splotches, do a little bit of a random pattern. This glue is going to be holding on our flock, which is artificial grass texture. So we want the grass to sort of work around our texture so that everything is working together. You can see I'm dropping the globs of glue in between the nicest lumps of beads on the bases, so that those lumps of texture will still show even after we've applied the flock. For the flock itself, just grab, pinch some tightly between your index finger and your thumb, and just tap it into place into the blobs of glue that you've placed. By tapping it in this way, you should be able to keep most of the grass standing vertical, and therefore get a more, a better sort of dynamic 3D effect. And when you've done that, grab your big fluffy brush and just brush away any flock that's gotten stuck to the miniature before we varnish. Just like the pet hair, that stuff's going to get stuck there if we varnish it, and it's going to look kind of goofy and fuzzy. So using a fluffy brush to get rid of it, great idea. For this again, I'm using my Badger Patriot 105 airbrush, and I'm just dusting the miniatures from a reasonable distance here, like 6 inches, just like I did with the primer, to apply a very light coat of the matte varnish. If you put on too much, it's going to get a little cloudy, it's going to get a little glossy. That's not what we want. As you can see here, I missed a spot before varnishing on Gregor Clegane's helmet, actually. There's a little spot that still shows primer. That's not great, and of course, if you just painted it now, it would look glossy where everything else is matte. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix some of my matte Mod Podge, the white glue I was using to affix the flock, in with some black ink. What that's going to do, the Mod Podge actually dries clear, so it's not going to offset the color, really, of the ink very much. But what it is going to do is it's going to make everything just a little more matte. So for a small area like this is a really easy correction to make. I've just dabbed a little bit of the matte Mod Podge onto my palette, and now I'm grabbing just the tiniest drop of black ink. I'm going to mix those together, and you'll see it'll go a little gray because the glue looks white until it dries up. Don't worry about that. It'll normally even out to pretty much the color of whatever ink or acrylic paint you end up mixing it with. And then you could just apply that onto the area that is affected. That is going to set up matte, or at least more matte than the ink would set up without it, and it's going to be largely imperceptible as far as a difference is concerned from the rest of the miniature that you've just varnished. Keep this in mind for any little areas you need to correct, because it can feel pretty bad to have to varnish twice or something, and you can start getting weird effects like cloudiness, like I mentioned, if you put too much varnish on one place. Finally, we're getting to the metallic areas of our miniatures. So to do this, I'm going to be doing a really heavy dry brushing of silver paint. I put the silver down on my palette, and I'm grabbing a wide bristle brush, and I'm going to just tap it into my silver paint. By tapping it in like this, I'm going to make sure that that paint gets right deep in the bristles, far up inside them. This means that the paint is primarily going to be applied to higher areas deeper inside the brush instead of down on the tips of the bristles. As such, now we can drag it across our miniature, and you'll see that it's going to pick out the high points while leaving the low points relatively dark, with that same color that we did earlier by mixing together our black and silver. Now, while that black and silver mixture has lost some of its gloss or its shine, the metallic effect, because of the matte varnish, when it's put side by side with our metallic dry brushing here, it's actually going to look more cohesive. It's going to be a gray that fits in quite well and looks like shading in the recesses of chainmail or in the fullers of characters' swords. All this is going to do is give us a sort of beaten, hammered, weathered metal look. Instead of the flat metal, knight in shining armor, Roland kind of look you get by laying just the flat silver paint onto a bare surface. Of course, if you had a miniature you wanted to look like, your knight in shining armor, you could just lay on your silver paint, but by dry brushing it on this way, you see it gets a scratchy texture, and it inherits sort of the brush strokes from our brush as we put it on, leaves the lower areas shaded, and highlights the upper areas. A big wide area like this back piece of armor on Gregor Clegane's horse is a great example of what kind of effect this can have by just scraping the brush around. You can see now there's all sorts of scratches and weathering just appearing as part of the coloring process. While you're working with metallic paints, there is one thing you should remember though. Metallic paints stain really bad. Not like in a, get it on your clothes, it'll stain kind of way, or maybe it will actually, I haven't tried. But if you get metallic paints on other areas, colored areas, like the yellow, for example, on Gregor Clegane, or the red on your Ramsay Bolton and Greatjon Umber, it's going to stain them, even if you wipe it away. So do be somewhat careful as you're doing this, just to avoid getting any massive overspray onto areas you don't want to be metallic. The last thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to dry brush in the exact same way, but with the bronze paint instead of the silver paint onto the decorative areas on Gregor Clegane. I found the flat overall, main battle tank silver look here to be striking, but a little uninteresting. So I've put the bronze on to the areas like the fist on top of his helmet and the decoration on his horse's armor, and now I'm going to dry brush gold over top of the browns to make the bronze's raised areas shiny and make them pop out a little bit. The bronze paint is really good, but on the small scale of these miniatures, I find that its shine doesn't really carry through as well as just its flat color. So by putting on a dry brushing of gold like this, we're just going to make the fist and the decor on his horse stand out that much more from the rest of the armor. Remember again, we don't want to put on so much that we make this look like gold, or maybe you do. Up to you, but in my case I just wanted to make sure that the raised areas were highlighted, so I'm putting a very, very, very light amount of this gold paint on top. As we finish this up, we are basically done with these miniatures. Grab some black paint, your preferred black paint. I use a black Artist's Loft acrylic. It's the flow acrylic kind, so it's a little more thinned, ahead of time. It's just a little, it has a better flow, I don't know what to say. So it tends to dry up a little smoother, I find, and I just lay that on around the bases of the miniatures to make them look finished. This covers up any overspill that we did when we were putting our brown washes on, and just pulls them all, unifies them a little bit, and separates them out from the ground cover a little bit. Makes them look a little more diorama-y, which I like. For you, you may want to consider putting a brown rim or a green rim or something if that suits your tastes more, but I find the black sort of playing piece rim very nice. And that concludes the process of painting these guys. Altogether, all three of them were done over the course of a week in little painting sessions after work and after activities and stuff like that. I think it took about, based on the footage, 3 hours to do all three of them between all the sittings, but that includes pulling out all the materials, laying them out on pallets and stuff like that. So this is a really quick way to paint. I hope you all enjoyed that. I hope you learned something, and thank you so much for watching. I hope to see you around on the channel again in the future, and until then, go play some games.